So this book was a long time in the making. It was about 9 years from when I first started conceptualizing it to when it actually was between covers. This was my doctoral dissertation at the University of Wisconsin. And in some ways, this is a book that, there's different ways I can sort of think about the genealogy of the book. When you look backwards, as you all know as historians, when you look backwards, you can come up with stories for how things are sort of inevitable or predetermined or whatever. But really, to me, the real genesis of this book started with a bowl of tortellini. I was eating dinner in my house in Madison, Wisconsin, and I had this sort of weird vision where my food was. Bear with me for a minute. It's a weird story. So my tortellini was sort of flying backwards. I'd been reading a lot of work on material culture and on where things come from, and so I had this sort of, in this moment, I imagined the different elements of my dinner going back to the different packages they'd come from, and then I tried to imagine all of the different people, all of the different environments that it took to come up with the wheat and the cheese and the tomatoes and the peppers and the onions. And and in this moment I sort of thought, my meal is this weird product of history, and this weird artifact of all these connections, all these social and environmental connections that made that possible. And so then I started thinking, well, how can I write a dissertation which I wanted to turn into a book? How can I kind of come up with a project that's going to follow through on that? Most of that idea is silly, but there's a kernel of it that's an interesting idea. How do you trace both environmental connections and social connections? How do you combine labor history and environmental history? And my training was as a Western Americanist. My passion has always been for the American West. I'm born and raised in Colorado. I made my way back here very fortunately. This is my part of the world. This is where I want to be. This is the place I care the most about. So I wanted to find a Colorado project. And so initially what I was looking for was a place to try to explore labor and environment together. And I had various ideas, but the one that really stuck with me, the one that really seemed to have some traction, was to look at interconnections between railroads, steel, and coal mining in southern Colorado. And so that's actually where I started. These three industries in Colorado, as in most parts of the United States, Virginia is a good example, were closely tied together. And in southern Colorado, there was actually a very close combination of these industries. So my initial thought was, okay, I'm going to look at these industries. But then, if you really want to look at railroads and coal and steel, you'd probably look at western Pennsylvania. You might look at Ohio. Southern Colorado was kind of a stupid place to go for those particular industries. And so I wanted to try to find some other reasons why these topics, why these dynamics were important. And so then I went looking for bookends, so ending places and starting places, and those are incredibly important for any historical narrative. Where you begin, where you end, shapes so much of the story. And I'll use discovered. This is like Christopher Columbus discovered. I discovered this guy named William Jackson Palmer, who was the founder of Colorado Springs and the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad and the Colorado Coal and Iron Company. Really interesting guy. He's this sort of Quaker romantic, but also a mining engineer, and a guy who sort of operated in high finance circles in the 1860s, 1870s. So Palmer seemed like an interesting place to begin. And then for an ending point, the Ludlow Massacre and the Colorado Coalfield War of 1913-14 seemed also to be a real sort of critical event in American history, a critical event in Western history. And what particularly interested me about the Colorado Coalfield War, first of all, there's all this inherent drama. It's one of the largest strikes, one of the most important strikes in American history. Front page news, really, for the whole 15 months when it was on. But it was also a really interesting place to think about the industrialization of the American West, to try to figure out what was Western about the Colorado Coalfield War and the Ludlow Massacre. Because my sense of coal mining, my idea of coal miners' strikes is that they'd go to Pennsylvania, you'd find this in West Virginia. It seems like we mostly associate coal in the United States with the sort of Appalachian area, and so I wanted to try to figure out, well, what did Ludlow have to do with the American West? And so that's what got me started with the book. And then in the course of, I guess I I could answer questions about the sort of process, but the short story is that it was a pretty painful project in all sorts of ways. I didn't know what I was doing. I was reading a lot of horrible stuff. I mean, it's one of the difficult things about being a historian, and as you know, one of the difficult things about being history teachers is you're mostly dealing with a lot of really evil, nasty things that have happened. I mean, I sat down for months at a time reading coal mine accident reports of mine explosions. I mean, where there's this sort of detailed, the state mine inspectors would go back through the mines, I mean, as they did in Upper Big Branch in West Virginia last year. They go through the mine, they map which way the bodies fall. They talk about, the condition of the skin, where does, I mean, which way mine timbers are knocked. All this is it's a sort of forensic art to try to figure out where the explosion began and what caused it. And I was reading through a lot of accounts of death and destruction and disempowerment and dispossession and all of that. So it was a difficult project in a lot of ways. And but what I ended up with was a book that really kind of falls into three parts. And in the first part of the book, what I try to do is try to understand why fossil fuels mattered in the history of the American West, why coal in particular mattered in the history of the American West. And I think coal is pretty much invisible in most Western history. And it's pretty invisible well, I would say coal's totally invisible in virtually every textbook treatment of the American West. The main place you see it is the smoke coming out of locomotives. But so one of the things I was really interested in trying to do in that first part of the book is show why the transition to fossil fuels really mattered in the history of the American West. And so what I argue there is that it was absolutely crucial. As you've noticed, you can feel it in your bodies. This is a really dry part of the world. And historians have long understood the relevance of aridity to Western history. But aridity also has important consequences for power, for energy in the American West. In particular, it means that there's, it's a lightly forested region compared to a lot of places. And it's also a region where water power, Colorado in particular, water power is not very helpful. And so I try to argue in the book that Colorado actually suffered from a kind of energy crisis during the 1860s. And it's really sort of the arrival of railroads combined with the development of coal mining that changes that. So then I try to look at the ways that coal shaped the rise of cities like Denver. Today we were underground in the Molly Kathleen mine. There's all sorts of ways in which fossil fuels were critical in the hard rock mining industry and the silver and gold mining industry in the American West. It made, those power tools that the guides spent a lot of their time talking about, where did the power come from for those? So coal was going into the boilers that were compressing the air that those guys were hooking up to the various gigas in the mine. The fossil fuels were also critical for processing the ores. Colorado in particular, unlike, say, California, most of the ore and this is something you learned on the tour as well, there's very little free gold, chemically pure gold lying around in Colorado. Placer mining in Colorado it peters out very, very quickly. So Colorado, most of the mineral wealth was underground and it was trapped in chemical compounds that took a lot of energy. These molecular bonds were holding the gold, they were holding the silver. And generally, it took a lot of heat to release the gold and the silver. So smelting was absolutely critical to the gold and silver mining industries in the state. And then, of course, the importance of railroads. So coal is powering the transportation network. It's making the gold industry possible. In terms of cities, again, railroads are critical. Smelters are very important for the growth of Denver and the growth of Pueblo. And in the case of smelting, one of the themes I try to develop in the early part of the book is that coal is not only important in explaining economic growth, but it's also important in understanding economic inequality and social inequality and struggles over power in this part of the world. And so when we look at a city like Denver, the areas that were the most polluted were the areas that were most commonly inhabited by immigrants and by people of color. So you have this sort of social geography that fossil fuels help to engender in the American West, where by and large poorer people are subject to greater environmental hazards. Meanwhile, in a city like Denver, people who have money are trying to get away from the Central Platte Valley. They're trying to get away from the pollution. you all were staying on Curtis Street, so you weren't far from Larimer Square. You saw the old part of downtown. One of the things that happens to Denver's downtown over the course of the 1800s, Larimer Square, most of those buildings are from the 1870s. By the 1880s and 1890s, the sort of commercial center of gravity for downtown had migrated east toward the state capitol building. And and there are a lot of factors there, but one factor is that wealthier people were trying to get away from the polluted area along the river. So you also start seeing, as in most American cities, you start seeing the rise of suburbs. Those suburbs were initially made possible by streetcars, and again, those streetcar networks were coal-powered. One of the things that distinguished wealthier homes and the sort of privileges of an upper-class upbringing or an upper-class living in a place like Denver was access to cleaner fuel, to more light. And so it was the wealthy who had electricity first. Wealthy people were typically burning manufactured gas. That gas was manufactured from coal. So they'd have clean-burning stoves. Their internal environments in their homes were cleaner. Poor people were, as in most parts of the United States, they were walking the railroad tracks. To go back to those painful documents that sometimes I was looking through. I looked through several volumes of the accident reports from the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad at the Denver Public Library, and you see all these brakemen in particular losing arms and that kind of thing prior to the invention of air brakes because they rode on tops, on the tops of trains, and they hand set the brakes. Imagine you're like coming down from a 11,000-foot pass in Colorado in December, and you're standing on top of a train and you're ducking through tunnels and all that. So a lot of gory stuff that the workers were experiencing. But every now and then, a hobo or a child would show up in those accident records, having been hit by a train in the rail yards, trying to pick up coal off the tracks. So they're gleaning coal. They're usually using antiquated stoves and that sort of thing. So just their home environments, their ability to be clean, their ability to live in clean. And so on the high plains, when it was wheat harvest season, steam thresher crews would actually move up and down the plains from Texas up to Saskatchewan, and again, burning coal in those combines. So, I'm not trying to argue that coal explains everything or that it's sort of the end-all, be-all of Western American history, but I do think there's all sorts of ways in which coal both propelled economic growth, but also created a lot of unsettling problems and exacerbated class divisions. And so in the second part of the book, then I try to look at what the rapidly increasing consumption of coal meant for the mining regions, for the coal mining regions. By the 1910s, the per capita consumption of coal in Colorado was in excess of. You can sort of conjure up a variety of places that you might think of as intensely coal-powered throughout history. So Britain in the 1850s, you might think, that's a really coal-powered place. Colorado was burning Coloradans were burning a lot more coal per capita than people in Dickensian Britain. They were burning more coal per capita than we do today in the United States. They were burning more coal per capita than Australia, which is the world's largest per capita consumer of coal in the present day. So, the bottom line is that people are burning a lot of coal. And so in the second part of the book, I try to understand, well, where does that coal come from, who mined it, and what was it like to mine coal? And so all of those increases in consumption necessitated increases in production, of course. And one of the big differences between coal mining and hard rock mining is that coal mining was much slower to mechanize, and it was much more difficult to mechanize. And so there's this real irony, because coal is powering machines in all sorts of other industries. Those machines are often replacing labor. That was part of the story my tour guide was telling today underground, right? Was how this drill could do this much more work, and essentially that was the story also of this many workers were no longer necessary in the hard rock mines. In the coal mines, productivity only increased about twofold between the 1870s and the 19-teens. The main mechanization didn't really occur until the 1920s, 1930s, and thereafter. And so what this meant then was that every sort of increase in coal consumption basically required more workers to go underground. So in the middle part of the book, I try to look at the immigrants, and I call them migrants because I want to try not to not draw too hard and fast a line between these various groups. Incredibly diverse workforce, people of more than 30 nationalities, every racial background that was heavily represented in the United States at the time was represented in the coal mines. And coal helped to bring, coal provided the jobs that brought some of these people to Colorado. But coal also was making the world a much smaller place. Railroads are a big part of that story, but so are steamships. So by 1900, it's about 8 days from most European port cities to most of the major American port cities. So people could often get from their homeland, whether they were in Croatia or Scotland or Sicily, they could get to southern Colorado in about 2 weeks if they knew that that's where they were going. And that was a cheaper trip. It was less risky because they could retrace their steps much more easily than before. Many of the miners never really intended to stay in Colorado. Most of them really didn't imagine that they were going to come and do work like mining coal. And so they come from all these different parts of the world. And that was actually probably the toughest chapter of the book to write in many ways, in terms of all these very different histories. Japanese, Koreans, Hispanos who are coming oftentimes from 5 miles away from the mines, because the region I looked at in southern Colorado was heavily settled by New Mexicans moving north in the 1860s, 1870s. And so you had all these different people, and they're coming underground into the mines with incredibly different backgrounds. And one of the central questions of the book then is, how do these people occasionally find that they had something in common? How do they occasionally come to believe that it was actually worth their while to rise up and to try to resist the impositions on them that were being made by their employers? And the largest coal mining company in southern Colorado by the 1900s was owned by the Rockefellers. So you have this incredibly powerful American family. And in general, the coal mining company, the locally based ones in a lot of ways were actually worse than the Rockefeller-owned ones. So you have these really powerful employers who are not afraid to throw around, they're not afraid to use violence, they're not afraid to capture local politics. They completely control the local court system by the 1890s. And so how did these people, who had a difficult time having a conversation, how did they come together? And there's this interesting pattern of strikes where they occur about every 10 years, big strikes in southern Colorado. And each major strike, there's sort of a different group that are the chief insurgents. So in 1884, it's mostly the Welsh who are leading the strike. By 1894, the strike is mostly being led by Austrians, which was a very diverse group in the 1890s. But we're talking mostly about Slavs. By 1903-04, Italians are playing a major role. And in the 1913-14 strike, Greeks were often portrayed as the main militants among the strikers. So you have this sort of changing cast of characters, but you have this persistence in militancy. But then over time, the strikes are getting more and more violent. The 1913-14 strike, probably between 75 and 100 people are killed on both sides. And so I was trying to understand both that persistence, but also that spiral toward the most violent strike in American history. And what I really trace it to is the mines themselves, and what I call the mine workscapes, to these relationships between miners and the environment underground. And so that's kind of halfway through the book. So I've said a lot very quickly. So let me see what questions you have at this point. I can also just keep going too, but does anybody have anything they want to ask thus far?
I'll ask.
Okay, sure.
I suppose about the operators.
Yeah.
You mentioned Rockefeller, and I guess I'm just wondering about did you some comparison with maybe Virginia or West Virginia in terms of or if you could just describe the landscape of the operators here beyond Rockefeller? I mean, he's certainly the largest and most powerful, but is there a great diversity of sort of different levels of operation? I mean, when we hear about all those mines we went by today, these different gold mines named for different individuals, it strikes me that one of the issues, of course, for the coal operators is that they're pretty divided as well. Coal miners are extremely divided in the way you described, but what about the operators?
Well, the operators were a pretty mixed group. There were a small number of large firms that dominated the industry, and then there were several. At any given point, there were several smaller operators, and even by the 1900s, there were a few, basically kind of small mines that were being run by former miners, guys who were actually kind of, who'd worked underground most of their lives, and then would start a small mine with 6 people or something like that. But the industry was really dominated by 3 companies by 1900, and so one of those companies was Colorado Fuel and Iron, and that was the biggest. Colorado Fuel and Iron was a sort of sprawling, it was kind of Colorado's octopus. It had come out of one of Palmer's firms, which was associated with the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. So it had coal mines throughout southern Colorado, and then it had iron mines in Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico. Pueblo, which is it's virtually always been Colorado's 3rd largest city. It was the 2nd largest around the turn of the century. Pueblo is a major steel center. So Pueblo is this really weird place where it's kind of like Pennsylvania mixed with Colorado. So you have like a nice mountain backdrop, but then there's all these like Croatian and Slovenian lodges and that kind of thing. It's a really interesting town. So Pueblo was a pretty large steel making center, and CF&I owned the steel mills in Pueblo. So CF&I was pretty. CF&I had a lot invested. They had a lot at stake, and they played hardball with the miners because. Any kind of miner strike would shut down the steel mills. Any kind of increase in wages drove up the price of every single product they made. So CF&I was pretty tough. And the guy who put CF&I together was a guy named John C. Osgood. Osgood was bitterly anti-labor, and Osgood. He basically sells CF&I, sells the controlling interest in CF&I to the Rockefellers in the course of a strike in 1903. And then he proceeds to become the major player in another company, which is the 2nd largest company in Colorado, which is Victor American. And Victor American was meaner than CF&I in most respects. And then there was the 3rd company, the sort of 3rd place company kind of shape-shifted. It would sort of. At one point it was called Northern Coal and Coke. Another point it was called Rocky Mountain Fuel. And of the major companies, it was the only one that kind of straddled southern Colorado and northern Colorado. So it was a little bit different. But during one of the things that is interesting then is you have all these capitalists who compete against each other fiercely most of the time. But in Colorado, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, they generally didn't have much of a problem banding together during strikes. And that's something that that was generally a feature of labor politics in Cripple Creek and Victor, and it was very much a matter of labor politics in the coal fields. So, the internal correspondence, the Rockefellers would complain about Osgood and what a nut he was, and that sort of thing. But they presented a united front to the public, and they essentially worked together. Yeah.
Diversity of the miners themselves.
Yeah.
And I think I might have read that in your book, that there was an actual conscious effort to make them as diverse as possible.
Yeah. There's to some extent. The companies. Yeah. There are various ways that that men or adolescents ended up in the coal mines. Some of them were directly recruited, and so the coal companies would hire labor recruiters, and some of these labor recruiters would essentially do the equivalent of picking up day laborers in Denver. Others, though, were off, literally beating drums in Japan or in. They would actually. These labor recruiters would make little kind of almost like gangs. They would march from village to village, in these really kind of backwoods areas, you know, and they would literally have a drum and announce their arrival, and then, you know, village peasants basically would sort of gather around and hear the news about the big opportunities in Colorado. A lot of the migrants seem to have come because of, you know, networks, chain migrations. So there's particular villages and particular regions that had large presences in particular coal mining camps. So it's sort of a mix, and some of those things that look like chain migrations are actually a product of, you know, a particular businessman. For instance, there's a family called the I'm blanking on their names, the Aiellos, who came out from a place called, I think they're from Cosenza in Italy. They come out and they established an early presence, and then they started working with the coal companies to recruit workers. So it looks like a folk migration, but it's actually a recruited migration. So anyway, you know, I mean, what I'm trying to say is people are coming in all sorts of ways, but there is a very strong way in which the companies are trying to divide and conquer. They're trying to keep it so that they can't talk, and they're trying to bring people in who don't get along. So they would intentionally bring in Asian workers to antagonize white workers. They often used people of color during strikes because they knew that was particularly, you know, I mean, that was really throwing the gauntlet down. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So at this time that all these Colorado mines were going on, was it also equally, was the East being mined as much? And if so,
Yeah.
was the news of these strikes going back east, and did this happen back east as well?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this is happening as part and parcel, I would say, of the larger industrial expansion of the United States during this period. You know, if you think of sort of the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, that's pretty much a water-powered industrial revolution. It's not really until the 1850s, 1860s in particular, that you start seeing the shift to coal. And so what's going on in Colorado is very similar to what's happening in West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Alabama. I mean, in a lot of ways, this is a sort of regional variant of a national story. And moreover, there's connections. There's connections both on the capital side and on the labor side. So the Rockefellers have other coal interests. The mine operators are, you know, I mean, they're reading their trade magazines and learning about what other industrialists are doing in the way of company towns and, you know, these sort of divide and conquer strategies. You know, I mean, so they're sharing information. And then on the labor side, one of the, you know, there's a sort of interesting moment in the second largest strike is in 1903-04. And that's at a moment when, you know, if we're in this place in 1903-04, we would be in the middle of a war zone. Victor and Cripple Creek were absolutely at arms because the Western Federation of Miners had taken over the district. You know, this whole area is called the district in 1894 in an incredibly successful strike. So you had to have a union card if you wanted to work as a barber, as a musician, as anything. Not, I mean, let alone a miner in Cripple Creek. So in 1903-04, the Western Federation, they get busted. Essentially, this is one of these cases where the mine operators, with one exception, the mine operators band together. Most of the sort of middle class, upper middle class people in town, they ally with the companies as a citizens alliance. They're basically vigilante groups. People are being rounded up and deported. They're being sent to Kansas. They're being, unionists are just being dumped in the deserts in New Mexico. There was a bullpen in Victor where hundreds of unionists were rounded up before being driven out of town. And what's interesting in the Southern Colorado coal fields then is the Western Federation of Miners kind of makes a play to control the coal industry. And the Western Federation was a really radical union. They were anarcho-syndicalists. So this is like, Big Bill Haywood. They want to destroy the capitalist system. But the United Mine Workers was the major union in the coal fields. And the United Mine Workers had actually always been a fairly bread and butter union. They mostly struck for wages and for conditions. They were not interested in a fundamental redistribution of wealth. And so the UMWA had power throughout the country, but they were established by the early 20th century. They were established in Pennsylvania, Illinois, Ohio, Indiana. That was an area that was called the Central Competitive Field. And the UMWA basically had fairly strong relationships with the operators after the anthracite strike. So there's a lot of cooperation. But then then the fight kind of was carried into West Virginia and into Colorado. And so this area, like West Virginia, it was sort of the front lines of conflict between all of these coal companies and organized labor. And that's why people across the country cared so much. They knew that this was kind of a bellwether, you know, in this larger battle between capital and labor over who would control the country. So that was a long answer, but.
I have a question. Was there a lot of turnover with people leaving Pennsylvania to come out here, or people coming to Colorado and then striking back, but heading back east?
Yeah. I mean, coal miners moved around a lot. They were extremely mobile. So it was. I mean, most coal miners would work in maybe dozens of mines over the course of their careers, and they migrated pretty freely during this period. And so there was quite a lot of traffic between Pennsylvania, Illinois. There were quite a few southern coal miners, both white and black, in Colorado as well. And so yeah, I mean, there's a whole way in which all these people are kind of, they're sort of networked. And there's rumors, I mean, people, the big attraction to Colorado over Pennsylvania generally was that wages were higher out here. And so that was what lured people out here. But then that also upped the ante. I mean, if people expect more and they don't get it, then they're more pissed.
Were they higher because there were fewer miners, or there were?
Well, I mean, there are a few ways to explain it. One would be that, one would be that the supply of workers was smaller, and so they had to offer higher wages to bring people out here. The cost of living was also higher out here as well, though, and that's where that issue of expectations versus reality came up, because the companies, I mean, these whether it was in print advertising or through labor recruiters, I mean, they would tell you what the wages were out here, but the coal companies were pretty loath to mention what the cost of living was.
Did the coal mines in the East have the same diversity in their miners?
Not quite. But they were very diverse for their day, and they were usually the most diverse places in their region. And so it was. I mean, in the East Coast, you didn't have Asians underground during this period at all. For instance, you wouldn't have had Hispanos or Mexicans, but you would have every kind of European and usually some effort at bringing in African Americans by this point. And often. Even within the British Isles, I mean, if you have Welsh and English and Cornish and Scots and Irish, I mean, they're not getting along particularly well. So I mean, this area was extraordinarily diverse.
You talked a little bit about adolescents
Yeah.
in the book, in the mines.
Yeah.
How young would they?
Well, I mean, Colorado sort of enforced the child labor laws, which they only acquired, I think, in the 1880s. And so prior to that, it's a little hard to know, because,
That was my next question.
I mean, you mostly know when they die.
Or were there ones that would just?
Well, you know when they get killed. That's sort of the easiest way.
But you didn't know when they snuck into work.
No, and I mean, there is a lot of evidence that men brought children in informally.
Right.
I mean, sometimes they were caring for children literally in the mines. And this is one of the important differences between. Well, I mean, the tour we took today. I mean, you got the sense for being underground. You got the sense for being surrounded by earth, for being encased in earth. You could sense your sort of vulnerability on the air systems and all the sort of technologies that were keeping that place inhabitable for you. I mean, in the book I sort of compare it to going in a submarine or a spaceship. It's a little like that. But the coal mines were very different in many important respects, and one of them is that miners actually had more autonomy in coal. So it's interesting. I mean, you think of like gold and silver, that would be. There's this sort of ideology or mythology that was somehow better work, more noble work. I mean, once they get the machines, they're basically factory workers. There's a bell that tells them when to start. There's a bell that tells them when to stop. They work with the machine all day, breathing that silica all day. In the gold and silver mines, workers often, they worked under their supervisors, direct observation, under their direction virtually all the time. I mean, our guide was talking about all these decisions that had to be made. He never talked about who made them, but the management always made those decisions in gold and silver mines. In coal mines, the miners actually had a lot of autonomy, and during this period, they largely decided when they were going to go to work. They largely decided when they were going to stop. I mean, foremen didn't come to their rooms every day or even even every week. So they could bring a kid underground, and I mean, they were essentially viewed as contractors because they were being paid by the ton. So the coal companies, didn't really think it was any skin off their back, because if a kid was causing problems underground and the dad couldn't mine as much, the dad basically bore the cost of that. But there's this really interesting expression that you see in the coal mining areas, and that's that some men had grown up in the mines. You see this again and again, and it's mostly referred to British guys who had started underground at 7 or 8. In Colorado, they usually didn't start until 14, 16, and then there's this intriguing way in which immigrants are sort of infantilized, and so immigrants take up the jobs that boys did. I mean, the first job that a boy did in a coal mine was called trapping, opening and shutting doors to keep the air current going the way it should. And then the next job was usually driving mules, and those were both, especially mule driving. That was a job that adult immigrants did. Yeah. All right. Well, so these underground environments, I mean, what I was trying to understand there is, I guess, what miners had in common, and what they had most in common was their work, and that work was they had a lot of independence, as I've just said. They had some understanding of just how significant their work was to the broader economy and to the broader society. Most miners understood that they had an incredible amount of power. If they banded together, if they stopped the flow of coal, then they could actually they could stop quite a lot. So they sort of have the same insight maybe that the oil sheiks do in the 1970s when they create OPEC. It's like, oh yeah, we can turn off the switch, and that's going to mess everything up. The miners also had there's a way in which the mine environment encouraged solidarity, at the very least encouraged some sort of awareness and some sense of responsibility for what men in other parts of the mine were doing, because these places are incredibly dangerous, and I mean, and there's so many dangers, but the basic, I guess, two main things, I guess, kind of cut at the reason why coal mining is so dangerous. One is that you're trying to, hey Duke, you're trying to, unlike trying to follow these veins and maybe branch out and make a stope where the vein gets large. When you're coal mining, you're trying to take out a whole layer of the earth. I mean, you're talking about stratigraphic deposits. You're trying to remove that entire strata. So that's a problem. I mean, how do you do that without things falling on top of your head? And then the second main source of danger is that you're trying to bring out a substance that's useful to you and important to you because it burns. And, and in Colorado, in southern Colorado, especially south of this river called the Purgatoire, the coal was heavily impregnated with methane gas. And so these are really gassy mines. This is also an area where when the coal was pulverized, the coal dust was extraordinarily explosive. So the mines are, the main dangers are from falling rock, from the mine face falling on you or the roof falling on you, or from explosions. The rock falls usually killed pairs of miners or single miners. Miners during this period usually worked in pairs, and they had a room to themselves. One of them would usually be the master, and the other one was kind of like the helper or the apprentice. So the roof fall thing, that's kind of an individual issue, and there's a lot that flows off of that. But with the explosions in particular, this gave miners a reason to care about who was 3 miles away from them in some distant tunnel, because what some Yahoo was doing all the way over there could pretty easily cause an explosion that could kill you. And so there's a lot of ways in which this sort of shared danger is one source of solidarity for miners during this period.
sort of work against the mine owners' plans to bring in groups that didn't get along?
Did it work
Did it
against the
work
company's
against-
plans?
Yeah, sorry, yeah, against the company's plans. Once they were down in the face of these dangers, did they find some ways to overcome?
Well, it's one of the. I mean, it's one of the really difficult things to understand about. That I've never fully gotten my head around, because these mine operators. I mean, these are high capitalists, right? I mean, these are guys who you would expect to be really economically rational, but like most sort of high capitalists, they're not particularly economically rational. So they didn't seem to really worry that much about the expense that explosions would cost. Even though explosions were actually incredibly expensive for them. I mean, usually hundreds of thousands of dollars, both in in the coal that they would lose, in all of the stuff that they had to fix, and then in the opportunity cost of not having the mine operating for months or sometimes even for years. But they just don't seem to have been very rational during this period. And I haven't really. I never got much insight into that. Yeah, I mean, they just seem like they were incredibly cavalier about that, and they seemed like they would rather take that risk. I don't know if it was because they were such gamblers in general, I mean, that they were so prone to speculate about everything. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if Will has any ideas on this front.
The similar case could be made for railroad
Yeah,
accidents.
yeah, which is incredible. Yeah.
And the brakeman you brought up earlier, and we didn't talk about it earlier today, but the whole issue of labor and accidents and danger and safety.
Yeah.
I think it has to do with, certainly the Civil War and the costs of the 1860s and what some of these operators, these men, thought was a reasonable or acceptable level of loss and destruction, as just part of what this business entailed. I'm right with you. I think wrapping your mind around it is very hard, because it's that attitude of, well, we just even though we're losing money on this, we won't proactively go after solving this. We'll continue operating just as we have been,
Right.
And accept the fact that lots of people are going to die or be injured.
Yeah,
So
yeah, and I mean,
I have my view is it comes out of
This is
that,
sort of
that more
cold-bloodedness almost.
generation of people who come through that experience into the 1870s, 1880s.
Yeah. I mean, it certainly, things change more rapidly once they were forced to bear a greater burden of the cost. I mean, a lot of these costs are externalities. They're not paying for the lost lives. They would often pay for the funerals, but that's about it. Sometimes they got charitable and gave widows and orphans a little bit. But there actually was, it was surprisingly expensive to them directly.
Well, speaking of which, the federal government hadn't really stepped up to pay for widows and orphans that substantially out of the war.
Right.
That took 20 years, really, to gather the kind of scope
Right.
that it probably deserved earlier.
Right. Right.
Did they ramp up in production during the Civil War as part of a war effort in which?
In coal. Yeah, there was a massive. I mean, it's one. There's a way of understanding the Northern victory in the Civil War. Is it's basically about Northern industrial society, defeating the sort of Southern agrarian society, and that's simplistic. But any sort of treatment of Northern industrialization or Northern industrial might, it really is heavily about coal. And I mean, one way to look at that is to sort of compare Pennsylvania versus Virginia. There's a good book by Sean Adams, where he looks at coal mining in Pennsylvania and Virginia during this period. And in Pennsylvania, just sort of production there skyrockets during the Civil War, and Virginia it goes up, but not nearly as rapidly.
You said that the mine operators, okay, if I understand it was the miners and then the mine operators, was there no consequence to the operators, say if there was an explosion at their mine that closed it? What about your corporate level, your owners? Was there no consequences to their operators? I mean, were they never fired, or if I mean,
Oh, okay. So you'd have.
how
I mean, this sort of hierarchy.
yeah,
You'd have.
how was the hierarchy?
I mean, the local heads were usually called superintendents, and so superintendent was the official in charge of a particular mine, and the superintendents usually were not held responsible. There's superintendents. There's sort of a club of them. Many of them had risen through the ranks during this period. These aren't guys who've gone to university. These are guys who've come up as miners. They generally are not fired after explosions. Occasionally they're killed in the explosions, but they're not fired. They don't bear any consequences. There's no way in which the people above them, the sort of head of the fuel department or the president of the company, they're not bearing any consequences. One of the more interesting discussions during this period, though, is whether shareholders should bear any responsibility, because the Rockefellers, they're the majority shareholders in Colorado Fuel and Iron. I mean, they're not actually operating the company; they just own a controlling share. And in a lot of ways, what you see in the 1900s and in the 1910s through these strikes and in other labor conflicts is this larger discussion about what the responsibility of shareholders actually is. And a lot of people try to hold the Rockefellers to account for the violence during the strike. And one story that the Rockefellers tell, and this is a story that you'll see quite often about the Ludlow Massacre in particular, is that John D. Rockefeller Jr. Is convinced of the error of his ways by this strike, and that henceforth the Rockefellers are a different family. This is sort of how you get from Standard Oil to to all of the good works that the Rockefeller Foundation does, and the sort of newer, cleaner Rockefeller family.
Wasn't that a PR?
Well, this is also the birth of modern PR. I mean, the Rockefellers bring Ivy Lee out, and so there's significant spin, but the union is spinning everything as well. I mean, one of the reasons in the book why there's one point where I go back to the Cretaceous, which is probably taking it a little too far, but the 1913-14 strike itself, I mean, everything is so polarized. I mean, every single source is from one of two perspectives, pretty much. There's no neutrality. There's no really difficult sources to work with, because everything's either black or everything's either white. And part of that is that both sides are actually very, very good at PR. And you have sort of Republican papers and Democratic papers. You have, there's a lot of ways in which things are being spun. But yeah, I mean, Ivy Lee and the Rockefellers they're very successful with that story. And the Rockefeller family continues to believe that very strongly. I mean, you can see them articulating this quite often, even to this day.
Well, I have a question.
Sure.
If the Rockefellers were the majority shareholders in this particular corporation, but they didn't actually run the operation, just how much input or control do they have?
Right, and that was one of the big discussions. That was one of the big debates, and so there were sort of two big questions. I mean, how much control did they have, and how much control should they have?
Right.
And I mean, my take is that the Rockefellers were largely didn't take responsibility for the company. They had very little to do with its day-to-day operations. They sent. Senior sends out one of his old lieutenants, this guy named Monty Bowers, he's just ridiculously crusty. I mean, you just read in his letters, and the guy's just a piece of work. He's a curmudgeon, and he's sort of their man out here. He didn't seem to keep them very well informed, but they also ignored a lot of what he was telling them. They didn't ask very hard questions.
So they didn't, in effect, live up to their responsibility as being primary shareholders to know what was going on.
Depending on what you think their responsibility was, So I mean, they were not being particularly responsible, and one of the things that comes out of the strike then is that they resolved to take greater responsibility. But their sort of main mechanism for doing that is to start a company union.
You talked about the records.
Yeah.
Of course, we have records on.
And in the Civil War, we had journals and we had diaries. And
Yeah.
Does your research find that from miners?
Miners, no.
I mean, so how do we know what happened
done in that mine, and their relationship with rodents, and their relationship with others, and
Yeah.
you know, how do we know
It
what
was
went
hard
on
to
down
figure
there?
that
I mean,
out.
how do you get that information when there's not that written record? There's not those pictures of battles and that we have from the Civil War.
Yeah.
It's like this untold history that's down there. That how do you get those little pieces to put here?
You spend a long
I-
time.
I saw back here those 20 pages
Yeah.
of.
Yeah, no, I mean,
But-
that's the I mean, a lot of it was kind of needle, looking for needles in haystacks.
Is it family after family after family history?
No, because I mean, one of the big, it's one of the real difficulties of labor history in general is that I mean, most working class people in U.S. history haven't been particularly literate. And if they did
That
write
was my
stuff,
next question
it-
is, what
yeah,
class
they're not-
of workers were these?
oh, these are
That if you really, they wouldn't leave anything because of
no.
their,
I mean, most of them weren't literate in their native
Right.
languages, and what they were writing wasn't being kept in most cases. I mean, they were moving around a lot, for instance, which makes it. I mean, if you're moving 15 times over the, if you're moving 15 times in 20 years, what do you bring with you? And so there are basically no, family sets of letters from this period. So I looked for miners' voices in testimony, both during the strike and in coroner's inquests and that sort of thing. There were some oral histories done in the 1970s, which turned out to be pretty useful because some of those miners, I mean, by and large, those miners weren't working in this period, but a lot of times they were working in mines that were similar enough that I felt like that was an acceptable alternative to nothing. I also, I mean, one of the big moves that you have to pull as a historian is you have to widen the lens from time to time. So if you can't figure out, what people in a particular mine or a particular mining region were doing, you have to expand the lens. And so, John Brophy, who was a major leader in the United Mine Workers, has an autobiography. He mostly mined in Pennsylvania and Illinois, but the underground environment was not substantially different. So I had to try to piece a lot of different things together, and just do the best I could. Yeah.
Could you have drawn on like folk songs and ballads, or were they not? Did they?
I looked. I mean, it's again, this is something that to me is sort of a mystery, because there's such a rich folk song literature from other parts of the country, and I could find very little from Southern Colorado. Part of that, has to do with the whole sort of, and these are things I don't know much about, but part of that has to do, I think, with the whole sort of discovery of Appalachia. How do you all say it anyway? I don't know how to. Appalachia. Appalachia. But I mean, the John Lomax and people like that who are who record these songs in the 20s and 30s, they're going after a certain. They have an idea of what sort of this truer older America is. They don't look to Southern Colorado. So I mean, I found a few songs. I found a few. I mean, there's songs about Ludlow that come afterwards that are really useful for looking at memory, but that wasn't something I was looking at in the book. So unfortunately, that wasn't as useful as I'd hoped. Yeah. How much more time do I have? How much more time should I take?
I think we agreed to an hour. So we just make it 10,
Sure,
15
10
more
to 15 more minutes. Okay. Yeah. So the underground environment. I've really, really glossed over that. But one of the things I really wanted to try to bring out in the book, because it was the thing that really surprised me, was how proud miners were of being coal miners, and how much pride they took in this work, and how much knowledge they had. And I mean, and I think that there's one of the things I was trying to argue against in this book is the idea that people know nature through the sort of upper class view of nature, that we understand it through poetry or through literature, and it's through this sort of leisurely retreat. And I really wanted to show how mine workers, and this was inspired by a fine historian, Richard White. I wanted to try to look at how miners knew nature through their labor. I mean, what they learned, what they had to know, and the two things that they really were concerned with was making as much money as possible under this contract system and staying alive underground. And both of those things actually required, I mean, today, for instance, you saw the shot patterns. You know, in the coal mines, the sort of basic labor process was, it was a little bit similar, but different in some important ways. Coal was soft, so instead of drilling with hand drills, generally when they were actually working in the coal, they used augers. So they would use augers to drill holes. They would set their charges, then they would go and hide behind something, set off the charges, and then come in and load up the coal. Doing that right, doing that as efficiently as possible actually required a lot of understanding of the explosives, a lot of understanding of how coal fractured. You got more money for bigger chunks, generally speaking. There's a whole sort of art to that. There's a whole sort of science to staying alive. How often do you set timbers above your head along the mine face so that you don't get killed? There's this real kind of evil structure in the way the industry was set up. You know, this is sort of one of those things where this was just an age-old way of doing things. But miners had to make choices about, you know, should I try to get more coal out or should I be safe? And they were constantly forced to kind of make those decisions. So I try to sort of, you know, find or recover the sort of nobility and the practical experience that miners had as a way of trying to understand their world. And then what I try to look at in the rest of the book then is this trajectory, this sort of downward spiral toward violence. So I argued that, you know, that there was a sort of way in which resistance came up from the mines and expressed itself on the surface through, initially through actually marches. So in the 1894 strike, there's this incredible march that covers a huge amount of territory in southern Colorado. And the coal miners, and here I'm making long stories very short, but I know you all have the book, so you'll get the details. The coal companies respond to this by, you know, I mean, they try to break the strike. Eventually they succeed. And then once they're done, this is 1894, so this is the year of the Pullman strike. This is when supposedly, you know, American industrialists learned that, oh, company towns, you shouldn't really do that because look at what happened at Pullman. Now, the operators in southern Colorado who really hadn't had company towns prior to this say, look, we have to turn the screws on these workers. They have too much freedom underground. We can't really do a lot about that without fundamentally reconfiguring the industry. So we'll try to take away their freedom on the surface. So the companies actually sort of import company towns, and by the 1890s, then they're building you know, sort of classic company towns where they own everything. They own every miner's house. They own the store. They control the you know, what medical provisions there are. They have gates around the entire camp. There's marshals at the gate. They won't let, you know, I mean, in 1913, the coal companies get a lot of flack because they wouldn't let the governor of Colorado into camp. The marshals were under strict orders not to let anybody in without a pass, and they followed those orders. So these are you know, sort of closed corporate spaces. The whole idea of doing this, you know, was to try to contain the unrest that was coming up from underground. And what I argue in the book is that this backfired. This may have worked for a while, but this had several important consequences. And one of the most significant, I guess this is sort of the same consequence but different ways of looking at it, this expanded the range of issues. The strikes in the 1800s were really about workplace matters. And you have to know a decent amount about coal mining really to understand most of the strike demands. I mean, there's wages, and oftentimes hours were part of it because not all miners were contractors. They were about political life. They were basically about political and civil rights as well as on-the-job rights. So they're part of this larger debate over what people at the time often referred to as industrial democracy. This also meant that women and children had a greater, they had sort of direct concerns. In the 19th century, they clearly had plenty of concerns about what was happening underground. They cared how much money came home. They cared about the dangers at work. But in the 20th century, they're also, you know, they're frustrated about company towns, you know, company doctors. This whole sort of system of control. They're resisting. And so by the time you get to the 1903 and 1913 strikes, women and children are really playing direct roles. So, you know, the book kind of charts a circle. I start with the Ludlow Massacre and the miners' uprising that follows, and I come back to it by the end. And my hope is that by the end, it seems like an even more interesting and an even richer and an even more tragic conflict. And by the time I come back full circle, one of the things that I'm really trying to show is that this 1314 strike is usually reduced to the Ludlow massacre, to the deaths of 18 strikers, mostly women and children, on April 20th, 1914. And that's an absolutely critical event, and it was an absolute tragedy, an absolute wrong, an absolute injustice. But what I hadn't learned very much about was what happens right after, which is this sort of uprising. And workers actually head to the hills. They take up arms. I mean, that's what these guys are doing on the surface. On the cover of the book. They've just returned from destroying a company town, killing several strike breakers. And so I wanted to try to show that miners and that mining families more broadly, they didn't quite give as good as they got, but they weren't powerless victims. They lost the strike, and they lost a great deal in this greater conflict. But they also had more power, I think, than most historians have credited them with. And so that's really kind of where I end, is with the end of the strike. Your questions have brought up all of the ways in which the story continues forward. There are other books who've done a really nice job with that. So that's largely how I excuse myself from the sort of 1915 and onward piece of the story. But so I don't know. What other questions do you have? And I don't know what other there's it's a big book, and it's a fairly complicated book. So I've just tried to give you some main sort of narrative threads, some main issues.
Other questions?
You've had a very long day, so.
Is that it? Thank you.
Thank you.